Hello everyone, and welcome back to the comparison between the Tein Medieval Pro and BC Racing coilover kits for the torsion bar Hondas. If you haven't checked out part 1 of the series, please go do that now. It's playing in the background. This video provides some powerful insight that will be important to understand before you see what we are doing here under the vehicle today. We're going to go over measurements, weights, and really discuss important differences between these two kits and help you come to a decision about what might be a best choice for your build. Once you've done that, come back here and tune in because we're going to do an installation on the front of this vehicle. We're going to look at a stock strut, a Tein front strut installation, as well as a BC front coilover installation. There's going to be a part 3 as well where we cover what they're like on the road, how they feel, and also go into more detail on the rear installation and some of the intricacies surrounding that. Now let's get under the car and do some measuring. I have the ride height set on my CRX, which is what I'm going to be using for the test, exactly where it is at static ride height. I've just removed the wheel, marked on the fender with a plumb bob, direct center line above the hub nut, and have replicated the measurement with the wheel removed. So now with this in place, I have a temporary strut in this vehicle right now. It is a KYB XLG, which is just a OEM replacement strut. You can see there's kind of a mess going on down here. These struts were originally fitted to a different vehicle. The one thing that these struts have had is the drop knuckle mod. So the original pinch bolt indent is actually just right above where my finger is. What you do is you actually just cut another indent higher on these struts, and that allows you to drop the strut down in the knuckle farther. You're only limited by how close you can get to the CV shaft boots. You can see here we're fairly close, but we're not touching, so you could actually stand to go just a hair further with this, and then you just have to cut off the brake line bracket. And the guy that modified these particular struts, he just put the brake line bracket back on the car using a hose clamp. So anyway, with these in place at the height I run my CRX, which I don't run it as low as I've run my cars in the past because I have a heavier B-Series engine in it now, and I actually prefer to ride the car a little bit higher. I am sitting with not a lot of suspension travel. So these currently don't have bump stops installed, and that's just because they were sitting on the vehicle while it was parked in my driveway for this test. But that washer up there is the hard stop limit. The strut cannot travel any farther up than that. And I am sitting right at about 1.75 inches before I'm going to bottom out this strut. So my total suspension travel on the front of this vehicle right now is less than 2 inches at ride height. And I should also note that I am running adjustable caster camber plates, which is going to impact the position of this top washer because every top hat arrangement is a little bit different than the stock ones. I believe these are engineered to be fairly close to stock, so we're talking millimeters up and down because you've only got so much room between the top of the strut and the hood anyway, so you can't go too crazy with this setting. I'll show you what I mean. Here's the top hat on these struts, and the Teins, for example, and the BCs have an adjustment nut up here, so you could only push the strut so high before it's going to start contacting the hood. And you can actually see on this vehicle with my Teins installed on a different set of top hats, I actually was rubbing my composite hood just a little. If you have a thin steel hood, you're not going to touch. Thicker composite hoods, you might touch. Everything, you're playing a game of millimeters. So with these top hats installed, that's the measurement I'm getting with these XLGs, that obviously these do not have any sort of adjustment built into them whatsoever, so there's nothing on top of this nut. Now, I'm going to remove those caster camber plates for the purpose of what we're doing today. And I have to remove them for the BCs because, again, you cannot use caster camber plates right out of the box with those. But I'm also going to just install the Teins using stock top hats, since that's what we've been doing all of our measurements off of. I want to make sure that it is consistent across all of the videos. All right, we've got our BCs installed and the vehicle is set to the prescribed ride height. And I've set the BCs up in what would be the most advantageous positioning. So I've dropped this collar up as far as I can, which is going to, again, reduce the total droop allowed, but it's going to give us the quote-unquote best case scenario for how the suspension will sit, or how much travel you'll have in the vehicle. Now, there's a qualifier with this. Would you be able to compress the spring this much using, like, would the weight of the vehicle compress the spring this much? I'm betting no. The spring is 6 inches long. Keep that in mind. And the spring starts about here. So you're saying in this configuration, the spring is compressed about 1.25 inches. The car is just not that heavy. The reality is, if I put this spring in here and put the vehicle on the ground, I would not have this ride height. The wheel would be lower. I would sit higher off the ground. So I would have to run a shorter spring, which checks out because I have a friend that runs these and he likes his car to be nice and low. And he actually purchased aftermarket a shorter spring to run on his BCs. So you could totally do that. Now, let's say you don't want to run the coil spring at all. There are people that run these BCs and just use them as struts and keep the stock torsion bars in place. If you do that, great, and you are going to be gaining some suspension travel. If you do, again, I have this body mount pushed all the way up on the strut as far as it can go, and I am looking at, actually I measured it here earlier with calipers, and I think that's just a better way to do it. Get those here. Zero them out. All right. You're looking at right at 2 5/8. All right, so yeah, you're gaining a little bit of height here, or a little bit of travel here over, say, a KYB factory replacement strut. So we'll call that 2.5 inches because it's kind of wavering around here, and this is obviously a tight area to work in. So you got 2.5 inches of total travel, and that's assuming you don't have the bump stop at all. You're obviously going to run into the bump stop before you completely compress everything, and so unloaded height before you interact with the bump stop, you're actually only looking at about 1 inch, call it, of travel. So you've got 1 inch of travel before you pick up on the bump stops, and then you have 2.5 inches of travel if you just completely obliterated the bump stop, which also, just as a note, is not possible. So you can't completely flatten a bump stop. One of the things I hear feedback on the BCs a lot is that they're more compliant or more comfortable. They come with softer spring rates, so that makes perfect sense. If you're running the BC recommendation for springs, then you're going to have a softer ride. But you're, at this height, going to be hitting the bump stops quite often, and that's just the reality. The Teins are the exact same way. I hit the bump stops a lot, but they're not crashy because the bump stops help control the ride really well. The BC's bump stops themselves are softer than the Teins, without question. The material feels softer. I can really squish it very easily. You can see that this first entire ridge is hollow, and then the next two are solid. In comparison, here is the Tein bump stop. It's much harder. I can't really hardly squish it or deflect it with my fingers as much, so I believe the durometer rating is higher on the Teins. They used to mark them so that you could understand exactly what they were, but they don't any longer. So I think this is made out of a slightly harder material. It also is not hollow on this first ribbed section. And the aftermarket bump stop availability is vast. It's actually an interesting field that you should do some research on if you feel inclined. But bump stop tuning is actually a really important part of overall suspension tuning. And this was a design choice made between Tein and BC to put the bump stops in the way that they did. But everything matters. These are 3 large ribs, one of which is hollow. These are 4 smaller ribs, none of which are hollow. This appears to be a harder durometer. All of these things factor in to make the bump stop feel differently. And as much time as you're going to spend on this bump stop, believe me, it is an important part of the suspension setup on these vehicles. So this is definitely going to feel a little more compliant than the Tein bump stop will. So this is best case scenario, like I said, but now let's see what it would take if I spun this lower mount out and put it where BC recommends it out of the box. And let's see what we have to work with then. All right, we've fixed the lower mount where BC recommends it, and interesting, we are on the bump stop. So to get my prescribed ride height, let's just ignore the spring for the moment, because I think in order to get this ride height again, I would have to lower this perch down. And I don't know if I'd be able to get this low enough to allow the spring to sag enough to where it would let the car sit this low. I'd have to play with it. But let's just say I could. And even if I wanted to, I could just get a shorter spring or whatever. But the spring does not change the fact that at my ride height, if I had the body here, I'm now on the bump stops. Now, I'm not compressing the bump stops, but it's almost... It's almost like I planned it this way. It's crazy. I'm sitting exactly on the bump stops. It will only move up and down a fraction of an inch. So just so everyone can see what I'm looking at here, my actual height from the bottom, or excuse me, from the apex of the fender, and again, this measurement, this mark is plumbed down to the hub nut. And I am directly centered inside of my hub nut. And now let's go up here and look at how much travel we have. And you can see we have exactly the height of the bump stop. So not a lot of travel here if you have the setup this way, which I think you would have to do in order to get the spring perches low enough to allow the spring to sag. Because again, I haven't moved these spring perches. This is how BC sets them up. This would require over 1.5 inches of compression on the spring just with the loaded weight of the vehicle. So, but again, regardless, let's say you don't run the spring at all, run torsion bars, great. I would need to push this collar up for sure in order to give myself more space, or I'm just going to be riding on the bump stops constantly. So interesting. You know, it's not the end of the world. Guys run around on the bump stops all the time. It's definitely not what you would call ideal, but for a street car, if you're going for a look, you could certainly get away with it. Now, the other thing to consider then is droop. We talked about it earlier, so let's measure it now. We have 11.5 inches from the arch of the fender to the hub nut here. I'm going to let the suspension down all the way. Jack's completely clear and no longer touching. Let's get our tape measure going. And let's measure from the hub nut, centered on the hub nut, up to the arch on the fender. So hub nut up to the fender. We are at 13 and I call it 13.5 because I keep wavering up and down a little bit. So we've got about 13.5 inches of droop with the coilover set up this way. Remember, if I raised this lower perch up, I would have even less not overall droop, but the lowest travel point on the wheel would be even less. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I was actually able to raise this. I think it was 3/4 of an inch that I was able to raise this before it bottomed out. So I'd have about 3/4 of an inch less of actual droop travel here, or well, total distance down, because the length, the total effective length of the strut will have been shortened by the distance I'm able to thread this up. So I'm going to wrap up with the BC here and throw the Tein in. I want to do the same measurements with the Tein while I have everything unhooked. One other point that's interesting to note is how much room you do have on top of the BCs versus the Teins, because the problem we discussed earlier about how you're limited on height here because of the hood. Where with the adjustment nut installed, you know, if you look here, you can see you've got a decent amount of space there between the bottom of the ruler here and the top of the chassis. And I measured that earlier off camera, and I got right at 29 millimeters of clearance, or 29 millimeters protrusion from the body up to the top here of the BC adjustment nut. So I'll do the same measurement for the Teins just for comparison's sake. Remember, the BCs, this is a fixed height. You cannot change unless you modify the system somehow in order to, you know, if you're running custom top hats and then you have to run custom spring seats and things like that. With the Teins, this height is going to be variable depending on what top hat arrangement you run. I'm going to be setting it up with the stock top hats, and I'm going to be putting the coilovers together in the recommended orientation that comes from heel toe. With the Teins now in place, I have reset my ride height here to the spec that I run my car at, and let's dive inside. So as you can see, it is nearly the same story with the Teins as it is the BCs. There's more room here, but not by much. The bump stop can physically move up and down maybe a little over 1/8 of an inch. So that means I've got about 1/8 of an inch of suspension travel before I pick up on the bump stop. Now, I don't actually run my car exactly like this, and I'll explain in just a second. The total height from where the bump stop is captured at the top and to the body of the strut is about 1.5 inches, right at 1.5 inches. So it's actually, from, I can see it a little better than you can on camera. It's just a shade over 1.5 inches of total height. Now, because the body of this strut is fixed, I cannot do any adjusting down here. But what I do have an advantage of being able to do with the Teins is I can adjust everything up here within reason, as long as I don't contact the hood. So a couple of things that I do, and these are like tips for people running Teins if you want to follow my lead here. There are 3 washers on top of the Teins. We've talked about them earlier. There's a big washer, a spacer, and then a small washer. The big washer is an absolute must. You cannot run without it. It will push the rubber bushing for the strut top straight through and out of the mount, and then it will bust the strut through your hood. Do not run without this big washer. It is a safety mechanism that keeps the strut from popping through the factory mount. Having said that, the spacer and the lower washer, those can go. And if you take them out, you're going to get 3/8 of an inch of space additional travel, which is about 9.5 millimeters. And it doesn't sound like much, but again, we're fighting for millimeters here, and 10 millimeters makes a big difference. The other thing I do is I don't run the factory top hats. So I've run spherical top hats before, and I now run caster camber plates that have spherical mounts in them. And the advantage of this setup is that it physically moves the strut up even more in the chassis. And effectively, what I'm always trying to do is get this adjusting nut as close to the hood as I possibly can, because that's going to maximize my total travel. In fact, if I had it my way, the Teins would move their adjusting nut to the bottom of the strut, which is how some Conies used to come, and I would love to see this whole situation up here be shorter. The higher you can get this mount, the more suspension travel you end up with under the vehicle. So that's our fixed height at ride height. And again, y'all, you can run your car higher than me. This is not like you're definitely going to be sitting on your bump stops all the time. This is how I run my car. But check out the droop. This is really where it comes. A clear advantage to the Tein is in that droop level. So we've got the jack fully out. Let's get our tape measure going here. And we'll do the same measurement that we did before, centered on the hub nut up to the chassis. And we've got 14 1/4 inches, so 14 1/4 inches of droop here. So the total shock length is far longer on the Teins, meaning that the wheel can travel this far down before it will try to pick up and leave contact with the road. So advantages, disadvantages to both systems. You be the judge on which system is the right setup for you. I cannot tell you what your needs are, but I can just show you the facts between two systems that I've been able to test for you here today. I'm going to go up top real quick and check that height clearance, so give me just one moment. Here we are up top, and again looking at the distance at the highest point down to the body, and you can see the Teins sit quite a bit higher. A big part of that is due to this factory mount that I'm running. When I run these caster camber plates up here, the mount actually does drop down some, which is really great, and that's what gives me that extra room to be able to remove those spacers under the car. Currently, this distance, we're sitting right at 50 or so millimeters, so it's definitely sitting up more proud of the chassis than the BCs were. So again, the goal or the effort here is to just get this as low as possible. Now, I do want to have a conversation about the rear that ties in with the front. I've had this evidence of front shock travel being limited in conversations with other enthusiasts before, and I get a question somewhat often that is just, why don't you raise the car, gain more suspension travel? So the answer to that is, I do run the front of the car about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch higher a lot of the time. This car looks pretty good with a little bit of reverse rake in it, but I'll drop the nose down some to give it a bit of a forward rake, really just for looks, kind of however I'm wanting the car to look around town. But when I'm taking it on these larger mountain drive road trips, or when I'm trying to set it up to really handle it its best, I do raise the front of the car a little bit. But you can only go so high on the front. All of that droop travel is really nice to have, but you can't really access it at ride height just when you're driving, and that is because of a limitation here at the rear. So I want to talk about that a little bit. The current coilovers in this vehicle, these are V2 Teins, exactly like what we have been discussing. This is just an older set that I have currently installed in this vehicle, and the spring has zero slop in it. As you can see, it's tight inside of the chassis. It's hard to tell, but I actually have it preloaded a little bit. I would say maybe a 1/2 inch or so of preload, and I'm nearing being out of room on the collar. If you can see here, the adjustment threads, they run to about here. So, I've got another, I would say, probably 1/4 to 3/4, or 1/4 to 1/2 inch of thread left on the adjustment collar that I could preload the spring even farther. But this is fully drooped. no weight on the suspension whatsoever, and this is as high as I can get the rear coilover to go, and that is due to shock length in the back. So this shock is fully extended and the spring cannot push the vehicle any higher. If the shock was longer, you would also need a longer threaded portion here on the shock, but that would be the only way to get the ride height any taller. So my car sits at a height that is effectively dictated by how high you can go with this rear coilover setup. If I could get the rear of the car higher on the Teins, I would likely run the front higher, especially on these long road trips, just because a little bit more travel in the front would be great on these long hauls. Around town, I'm not pressed about it, really. I've had it set at this height or lower for so long now, I'm just really accustomed to it. But it does not mean that it's for everyone, and that's just something that you'll need to keep in mind when you're using one of these systems. I'm not going to be putting the BCs on the back of this vehicle for testing purposes, at least not at this time. I'm hoping I can do a follow-up feature with that work in the rear, but I don't have time to do that right now, as I am currently getting the vehicles prepped for an event. So this explanation really is more to serve as a follow-up to the front. I want to have a separate conversation about the rear entirely, with a comparison between Teins and BCs. I'll want to measure droop, I'll want to measure total compression and all that kind of stuff, just like I did in the front. But before I start getting flooded with questions about, well, if you're on your bump stops, dude, you should just raise your car, I want to kind of get ahead of that and explain, well, I already am about as high in the front as I can go, unless I want the car to have a ton of reverse rake. And by a ton, I mean I obviously could raise the vehicle a little bit in the front and no one would ever know, which is why I do, as stated near the beginning of this, raise the front of the vehicle about a half or even 3/4 of an inch for specific events. I'll try to show some comparison photos of what that looks like on screen, and then you can kind of be a judge for yourself on which one of those looks might be similar to what you're either trying to achieve or what your vehicle is currently sitting at today. Anyway, that is all I wanted to do, was to talk about what the limitations are here in the rear briefly, and like I said, I'll be wanting to do a follow-up that shows greater detail comparisons on the rear coilover setups.